In this lesson, you're going to continue to build out the room feature of our chat application. So we learned how to use socket.io rooms in the last lesson, and we saw that in order to take full advantage of them, we're going to need to keep track of which users are in which rooms with which user names. So in this lesson, we're going to focus on setting up a few functions to keep track of our users over time. That's going to allow us to start tracking them in join and then access that data later, such as down below inside of the send message callback where we emit the message, or the send location callback where we emit the location message. Now I'm excited to do this, and in this video we're mostly going to spend time in a new file writing the functions necessary to track the users. Then in the next lesson we'll integrate those into this file, index.js. So first things first, inside of the utils directory, I'm going to create a new file called users. That's users.js. And in here we're going to focus on keeping track of our users in an array. So we'll start off by creating a constant users plural. It's going to start off as an empty array, and we'll add and remove data over time. In total, we'll be creating 4 functions in this lesson for this file. The first 2 we'll be creating together. The first one will be add user, allowing us to track a new user. The second one will be remove user, allowing us to stop tracking a user when the user leaves, such as closing the chat room tab. Then from there, you'll be adding 2 more. The first is get user, allowing us to fetch an existing user's data. And the final one, get users in room, allowing us to get a complete list of all of the users in a specific room. And that's going to allow us to eventually render that users list to the sidebar. So let's go ahead and focus on creating these functions in this file, and we'll even call them down below just to make sure they're working. Then we'll export them, and in the next lesson, integrate them into the application. So together, we'll start by working through add user so you can get a feel for exactly what we're trying to do. Right here, we're going to accept an object with 3 properties: ID, username, and room. Now, the username and room, we know where those come from. They come from the client. ID, however, that's something that's associated with the individual socket. So every single connection to the server has a unique ID generated for it. You'll learn how to access that in the next lesson. For now, though, we'll just make it up by using a number. Now, you could accept 3 separate arguments or an object with these on there as properties. Either way would work just fine. ID, username, and room are the properties I'm destructuring off of this first and only argument. Now, inside of here, we're going to do a few different things, and I'll be using comments to keep us organized. So first up, we're going to clean the data. So the username and room, those are provided from the client. We're going to go ahead and convert them to lowercase and trim them up, removing any extra spaces. And we'll also validate they were actually provided. So right here, I'm going to start by setting a new value for username. It'll be the old value, but we'll be using trim to remove spaces before and after. And I'll also be using 2 lowercase to make sure that those usernames are not case sensitive. I shouldn't be able to have a uppercase A Andrew and a lowercase a Andrew as 2 separate users. Now we're going to do the exact same thing for room just down below. So right here we have the original value. We're going to trim it and we're going to convert its case. And now what we're going to do is see if those were even provided. So if they are just empty strings at this point, obviously that's a problem, and the following code will allow us to figure that out. So validate the data. Right here, all we're going to do is set up an if statement. This if block will run if the data is invalid. We're going to see if there's no username or there's no room. So right here, using the logical not operator with username, or there is no room. So if either of those don't exist, that's a problem. The code will run, and what we're going to do is return an error message that can eventually be shared with the client. So right here, return an object. we're going to set up this object to have an error property, which is a string, and we'll provide a good message for this one. Something like username and room are required. Perfect. So now that we have this in place, we know that we at least have username and room with some value. And the next thing we want to do is make sure that the name is unique for that room. So if I'm joining South Philly and that name's already taken, I should not be able to join. Right here, we're going to add a little bit of code to get that done. Check for existing user. Now to do this, let's go ahead and create a new constant. We'll set up the variable and we'll use an array method on the user's array. The variable here could be called something like existing user, so we're looking for an existing user. And then we're just going to use something we've used before, users, an array, .find. So we're trying to find a match. Now we know we provide that callback function, we get access to each user that's in the array already, and it's up to us to return true if we found the match. So we're going to return true when the following two conditions have been met. First up, this user needs to be in the same room the person's trying to join. It's okay if there's two Andrews as long as they're in separate rooms. So right here, we're going to look at the user.room property, the one that already exists, and we're going to see if it's equal to the room they're trying to join. And using double ampersand, we want to also make sure that the username is unique. So right here, user.username equals the following, the username up above. So if both of these are true, then return is going to end up returning true. It'll be considered a match and existing user will be populated. Now, that's a problem. We don't want existing user to be populated. If it is, once again, we have an error we need to report so the client can respond accordingly. Right here, something like validate username. Down below, if there is an existing user, that means that this user can't be added to the same room. So I'll go ahead and return an object, setting up an error property like we did for the other error, and we can provide whatever sort of text makes sense. In this case, something like username is in use seems to make a lot of sense. Now, if the data is valid and we can add them to the room, it's time to actually store them. So down below, this code right here, it's only going to run when the user is ready to be stored. So right here, store user. We are going to create the object, push it onto the array, and we're also going to return it. So right here, const user equals. This is going to be a combination of the ID, the username, and of course the room. Then we're going to use this in two locations. Users.push is going to push that object onto the array, and we're also going to return it. I'm going to return an object, but instead of adding on the error property for when things go wrong, I'll be setting up the user property for when things go well. So that's it for this function. Now, I say that's it, but it's actually quite complex because there are a few different things that need to go down. Now that we have this in place, we can go ahead and move on down the list and work on some of the other functions, but before we do, let's test this and make sure it's working as expected. And to test it, we're just going to call the function a couple of times and make sure everything is getting saved as expected. Let's go ahead and create a new user. So right here, I'm going to use add user, and I will provide some valid data to get that array populated. So for the ID, we could just say it's 22, pick any number, it doesn't matter. For the username, we'll go ahead and pick something like our first name. And then for the room name, I'll go ahead and use South Philly for me. Feel free to use whatever you'd like. So with all of this in place, we can go ahead and console.log the user's array to make sure it contains what we would expect. Now let's go ahead and run the file. Down below, I'll use Control-C to shut down NodeMon, and for the moment, we're just going to run this file as a standalone script before we worry about integrating it into the project. So right here, that is node space source /utils/users.js. That's going to run just this file from top to bottom, and down below I have my users array with the data inside. I can see that things have been converted to lowercase, and if I was to add some spaces around the eRoom or the username, I would expect those to go away since we're trimming them. I'll add some spaces, rerun the script, and we still have the exact same data, which is good. Now from here, let's try to add a second user and test out some of that validation. So what I'm going to do is create a constant called res, which is short for results. Then I'll go ahead and use add user. And what I'm going to do is add a user with the following data right here. That's going to be an ID equal to something like 33. Just make it different. Then we'll set up a username as an empty string and a room name as an empty string as well. Down below, all we're going to do is console.log the results to make sure we actually get our error back. Right here, I'll rerun the script, and down below, we do get that message. User and room are required. Next up, we could try to join South Philly with the exact same name. That should fail. So Andrew and South Philly. I will save the program, rerun things, and I would expect that second error message right here. Username is in use. So far, things are working really, really well. We're able to add users, and we're also performing the validation necessary to make sure that things are working as expected. Now with this in place, let's go ahead and continue on to the other function we're going to create together, which is remove user, which is going to allow us to remove someone from the users array by their ID. Once that's done, I'll set you free for the challenge. So right here, just above our example code and just below the add user function, I'll create a new constant. I'm going to call this one remove user. Then I'll go ahead and set it up to be a function. I'll just use a standard arrow function. And over here, I'm going to accept a single parameter, just the ID of the user to remove. From here, we're going to attempt to find them in that array, and if we find them, we'll remove them. I'm going to start by creating a constant, and what we're going to do is try to find the index of a user who has the correct ID. So right here, we'll end up getting the index back. It'll be -1 for no match, it'll be 0 or greater if there is a match, and the array method we're going to use is users.findIndex. FindIndex is very similar to find, which we used above, though when a match is found, instead of getting the array item back, you get back the position of the array item. So right here, we're going to call it just like we would call find. We provide our function. We get access to the user. This function still runs for every single user in the users array until a match is found. And what we're going to do is return true when the user.id property equals the ID we are searching for. Now, in this case, we can take advantage of the shorthand, though you could leave it like this if you wanted to. Let's go ahead and use the shorthand syntax. That means I'll be removing the curly braces and everything inside. That is user.id equaling the ID parameter. So now index is a number. It's -1 if we didn't find a match. It is 0 or greater if we did. So in this case, if the following, if index is not equal to -1, that means we found a match. And what are we going to do? We're going to go ahead and remove it. Right here, we'll be doing that by first using return. We're going to remove the user, but we're going to return the user that we remove. Then we're going to go ahead and use users.splice. This allows us to remove items from an array by their index. So we start with the starting index. If you wanted to remove the first item, it would be 0. In this case, we want to remove the item at the position we found. So we'll just provide index. And the second argument is the number of items we'd like to remove. And in this case, we just want to remove 1. Now, this right here, this is going to return an array because we could remove more than just one item. So it would be an array of all of the items we removed. In this case, we're hard coding it, saying we're only ever going to remove one item, and we want to return an object, so we'll access the first one by its ID. So right here, we remove the item, we get back an array. We then extract the individual item, which is the user object of the user that was removed, and that gets returned. Now, there are other ways to get this done as well. For example, you could have used filter like we did with the notes application to remove a note. The disadvantage of that, though, is that filter would keep running even after it found a match. This code is a bit faster since find index is going to stop searching once the match is found. Now that we have this in place, let's wrap up the video by testing it out. Then we'll move on to the next lesson where you'll create those other two functions. So down below, all I'm going to do is remove the second user we're creating and that console.log, and I'm going to attempt to remove this user right here. So what am I going to do? A new constant removed user. Then I'll go ahead and use the remove user function, providing that ID 22. And down below, I'm going to console.log two things. First up, I'm going to log removed user to make sure that we got that back correctly. And then second up, I'm also going to log out the user's array to make sure it was actually removed from the array. So right here, let's go ahead and rerun the program and see what we get. We can see that we have an array as the value for users. That's from the console.log right here. We can see we have the object of the user that was removed. That's from the console.log on line 53. And then finally, what do we get when we print the user's array? It is an empty array, which is exactly what we were hoping for. So now that we have this in place, we're in a really good position to start tracking users. This video went a little longer than I was hoping it would, so I'm going to take the challenge and I'm going to move that into the next lesson. I'm excited to get to it, so let's jump right in.